another reason I'm not as prepared as I might be, as I spent the morning talking to Susan Lukey, who wrote the book, the Bible, about the Bellevue War. Anyway, I just wanted to know if, of the people here, when you've been to the main museum, have you noticed this very special artifact on the west wall of the museum? I mean, there's so much in there, it's hard to see everything. But this is an absolutely wonderful, it's called a sculpture. It's an absolutely wonderful thing. And this was just came to us, you know, kind of out of the blue. So the scene, of course, is the Bellevue War that took place on April 1st of 1840, which is why we're talking about this, because this is April, right? The scene that you see there was actually sketched in 1848. And to my mind, that's kind of important because it was very early on, you know, before history got distorted and people forgot. And so maybe that's the best likeness of the Brown Hotel and everything that we have. It was sketched by an artist from the New York Magazine because it went with some kind of a story that they were doing. But the building is supposedly William Brown's Hotel, and the men seen on the inside or of the building or on the building are some of his henchmen. The men in the street are a band of vigilantes that had been deputized by Sheriff William Warren. I found out, I think we got this in 2010, I believe, and I had forgotten, so I had to look up again. But the sculptor is a man by the name of David Seagraves. And I don't know if you had heard of him. He lives now in Elizabeth, Illinois. He has a big studio there. And this is called a prototype. It was finished and donated in 2010 by a man named Don Yeager from Bellevue. And I was picking Karen Brown's brain last night to see if anybody remembered him. He had a business in Bellevue for a long time, 2010, and he must have moved and he must be gone by now. But he is the reason that we have this. We helped him with a little information. He was working on getting this sculpture done. So this is a prototype because I guess when they do a sculpture like this, they always do a small one. It's a small sample. And it's all approved and everything before they do the larger one. The larger one was supposed to be 5 foot by 7.5 foot, cast in bronze, and placed either in the park on Riverside Drive or on the entry wall of City Hall. Does anybody know if this ever happened? Don contacted him a few years after that. I went over to Bellevue to see it, right? And I couldn't find it. And so I called him and he said, well, that the money had not come through yet, so it was still a work in progress. I don't know if the larger one of these ever happened, but there's another one, and this is just, you know, so big, but very, very heavy. I went over to try to bring it over to show it to you. It's very, very heavy and bolted to the wall. But there's another one in the library in Bellevue, like this. So what they told me, the way this was done, and this is a really special artifact for us, there's only 2. They told me that it was originally sculpted by the artist out of clay, and then there was a mold made of silicon. And then it was cast with a material called hydrastone, which is concrete mixed with a large portion of gypsum. Then, after it was turned out of the mold, it was finished with black. They didn't say black what, I guess black paint. And then there was a copper coating over the top of it so that it would have the appearance of bronze. And when you look at it on the wall, it does look like bronze. So this was to be exactly like the real one. Nobody remembers seeing a big 5-foot thing like this in Bellevue, so maybe it ended up never happening. But the drawback to this one is that it is very heavy and it'll chip if it's bumped.
Are you talking a big mural?
I'm talking a big sculpture.
Oh, no.
So it's a sculpture, and it was to be, it can go against a wall like ours is, even the big one, or it could have gone on the riverbank. But it's called a sculpture and not a painted mural. It's actually sculpted. So it must have never happened. So I've been trying to find out, but I don't know. Okay, so We are, because it's April, talking about the Bellevue War. It was 186 years ago this month, and questions still persist. There's probably, as we look at the history that the Historical Society has gathered together over the years, there's probably nothing that we have more information on than the Bellevue War. And there's so many different ways to look at it that probably dozens of brown bag lunches could happen. Books have been written, hundreds of articles, and yet we don't really know for sure what happened, do we? And we don't even know really if we'll ever know, because that was a long time ago. So those of you who are new to the story, this is kind of what Bellevue looked like back then. This is a little later than 1840. It doesn't have a date, but this is kind of what Bellevue looked like when this happened. But if you're new to the story, I found an abridgment of the Telegraph Herald's History of the State of Iowa. It was published in 1908. And again, the closer you can get to the incident, the better information I think you have. So I tried to kind of abridge that. And so the story went something like this, okay? In 1837, there was a party of immigrants that arrived in Bellevue, and they claimed to have come from Michigan, but I don't think anybody ever knows that for sure. They had very good teams and wagons. They had household furniture, and they had money, which was something that there wasn't much of on the frontier. And this group of people just appeared in Bellevue. They called it a colony, and the leader of the colony was a man by the name of W.W. Brown, William Brown. And he was very intelligent, he was a man of engaging manners, he was charming, and he came. Part of the information says he built a hotel, most of the information says he bought an existing hotel, but he was in the hotel business, and pretty soon he was elected magistrate of Bellevue. He was liberal, he was charitable, handsome, charming, and he was always there to assist the unfortunate. If anybody needed help, he had money, and he was more than happy to help them out. Anybody who was down and out. And of course he was very welcome because of that. And in a short time he became the leading citizen of the new little town of Bellevue. So by 1840, Bellevue was about 5 years old. He went right to work. He started various enterprises. He employed a number of men. He always had this conclave of men around. Most of them he employed as wood choppers. They would go out along the Mississippi and they would chop wood and they would stack it by the river. And then William Brown, one of his businesses was to sell this wood to the big steamboats that came up and down the river because they burned a lot of wood. So that was one of his enterprises, one of the ways that he made money. And this went on for a while, and I think that the people in Bellevue were slow to realize maybe what was happening because he was so charming and everybody loved him. He was slick. He was kind of the Gavin Newsom of Bellevue back in the day. He was just slick. And anyway, pretty soon they began to realize, in spite of what they wanted to believe, they began to realize that there was a large amount of counterfeit money that was being circulated around Bellevue and in the Bellevue area. And everybody wanted to know where this was coming from. Nobody wanted to believe that it had anything to do with William Brown. And maybe it did and maybe it didn't. But it always seemed to trace back to one of his employees somewhere along the line. And then when they tried to arrest the employees and take them before the magistrate, etc., they were all these people that worked for him at least were kind of in cahoots, so they would all testify for him, and they, so they were really having trouble, and this little band of thieves was really taking over. The other thing that they did, in addition to the counterfeiting, they were horse thieves. And horses came up missing on both sides of the Mississippi. Horses from Galena, horses from all over. But these horses would end up in the Bellevue area. but always there was a story or an excuse, or somebody produced a bill of sale or something. So they were really having trouble pinning this down and figuring out what was really going on here. Well, soon, as suspicions kept growing and everything, it kind of became known that Bellevue had maybe become the headquarters for a large gang of counterfeiters and horse thieves. And they had confederates. They weren't in this alone. They were scattered throughout portions of Illinois and Wisconsin, down the Mississippi River to Missouri. They had this was a big group of people. But the large body of timber in Jackson County that we've talked about many times, known as the Big Woods, is all in Jackson County. The timber was so thick that it made a good place for hiding the stolen property. They could hide all kinds of horses there, and we've had programs and read about Counterfeiters' Cave that was in the Big Woods, and so we know that all of this was going on, but lawmen couldn't really get in there to find them. It was kind of like, you know, you read the story of Robin Hood, and how the sheriff's men could never get to Robin Hood's men because they were hiding out in the forest. It was that kind of thing. And so this just went on for quite a period of time, and it just kept kind of growing and growing. But the Big Woods was a big part of it. Well, soon, and of course this is according to the Telegraph Herald, they found that there were stations. This gang had different stations in all these different places. And they extended through Jones, Cedar, Johnson, Mahaska, Scott, Louise, and Lee counties. They found stations for these gangs, and one of the stations was Brown's Hotel in early Bellevue. And it was there that the battle was fought in 1840 that we call the Bellevue War. It was fought to banish the boldest people in this gang and get them out of Jackson County. That's what it was for. Well, we've talked often too about Captain Warren, William Warren, and he was a very accomplished guy. He had the most amazing Civil War history. He served in the Civil War. He was a comptroller, and he handled millions of dollars that fed the troops and supplied the troops, and he was a very, very accomplished guy. He was Jackson County's first sheriff, and this was, of course, before we became a state. Captain Warren, as he was called then, Sheriff Warren, called a posse together, a posse of 40 men, and on the 1st of April, they marched to Brown's Hotel. When they were within 30 paces, according to the Telegraph Herald, Warren ordered charge, and the men all sprang forward and they quickly surrounded the building. All Brown, his wife, and all of these counterfeiters and horse thieves and whatever were in the hotel, and they surrounded the building. Well, it's hard to figure out kind of what happened next. We have really what I call three books that were written, and as you read these, you see different sides of the picture. It's hard to know what really happened. Maybe the first book we'll talk about is called Adjacent Wilderness. And it's right here if anybody wants to look at it. Interesting, because this copy was donated to the Historical Society in 1979 by Opal Golden. A lot of you knew Opal Golden. So anyway, so those aren't available now, but you could certainly check ours out and read it. And probably the library has it. Well, the two most important books we have are researched and written by Bellevue authors. Adjacent Wilderness, excuse me, was printed and copyrighted in 1953 by the Bellevue Herald Leader, printed at Tri-State Graphics in Maquoketa, and reprinted in 1976. It has not been printed again since then, so it's hard to get a copy. And I wish we could make that available again, because it's very, very interesting to read that. So in the picture you see Pastor A.J. Jar. I think that's how you would pronounce that.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that right? Okay. Did you know him, Karen? know of him?
Probably that type.
Aha, okay.
Yeah.
Well, he was born November 15th of 1914 in Redland, Iowa, and he graduated from Strawberry Point High School the same year my father did, so I think they must have known each other, you know? He went on to graduate from Wartburg College and Wartburg Seminary, and he served in churches at Nashua and Sheldon before he came to St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church of Bellevue. And that's how Karen knows about him. He served there from 1848 until 1957, and then he moved on to somewhere in Michigan, and I don't know where he is today, or if he is today. But he wrote this book.
Yeah.
So this is St. John's Lutheran Church, as it was one of the older pictures that we have, but it still stands. And there have been, you know, additions and things over the years. Well, Pastor Jar loved history. And so while he was in Bellevue, he became absolutely obsessed with the story of the Bellevue War. But he was frustrated, like Susan Lukey became frustrated, because there seems to be no clear-cut evidence to sort out the good guys from the bad guys. And but he was determined that he was going to get to the bottom of this. So he spent a year paging through old manuscripts, old documents, old newspapers, letters, Jackson County histories, memoirs, and going around and talking to old residents of Bellevue who might remember anything at all, or, you know, heard things along the way. What he found out was that the story of the Bellevue War was matched only by stories of the Wild West that he had heard everywhere. He said the characters were real people and the events really happened, and even the dialogue used was very accurate. The problem was that the accounts of the happenings varied so much that he was forced to piece together what he wrote so that he could come up with the most plausible story, right? And then he said he tried to, quote, to think himself back to the time that the war took place. So he put together the picture the best he could from all the evidence that he could find. And his resulting book was the story of, again, of one of Iowa's earliest settlements, which was Bellevue, of pioneer hardships, politics, crime, a struggle for power, friction between the northern and southern factions, and of local citizens taking law into their own hands. Maybe that's because there was very little law at that time, I don't know. We talked about Sheriff William Warren, and here we have a picture of William Warren. He was, when you read about him, he really was an awesome man. Well, Pastor Jar traces the transition of this area. He started at the very beginning, because as you know, first we were part of the Michigan Territory, and then part of the Wisconsin Territory, and then part of the Iowa Territory. And he agreed that under changing governors and legislatures, it was only natural that the enforcement of the law would be more or less dependent upon the attitude of the majority of the community, which put these people into office. But it was 1840, 6 years before we became a state. Captain William Warren was the first sheriff. But think about this, Jackson County is a large county, and he was one man on horseback, no cell phone, and he had to cover a vast and rugged area. So how much law and order did we really have when you look at it? He certainly couldn't have been everywhere at the same time. As he went on with his story, he talks about Alexander Reed, who you see here. And in our history, he was certainly one of the first settlers into the area. He and his friend James Armstrong, who settled in Bellevue, William Dias and William Jonas, and later John Bell came. John Bell, as you know, arranged for the platting of the town and became the first postmaster, and unabashedly named the town after himself. He talks about this, he does it all in 3 pages, it's very readable, and he had a way of writing that made you feel like you were right there when history was happening. So then he moves into the story, come on, Then he moves into the story of the 3 years that led up to this infamous war, okay? And like he said, you feel that you know the people by then. The leading citizens of the community, the powerful men such as this man right here, Colonel Thomas Cox of Bridgeport. And we've talked about him a lot. Thomas Cox, it has said, he was a large man, a very handsome man. He was the kind of man that when he walked into a room, he just kind of got everybody's attention. People listened to him. He was in Illinois legislatures before coming to Iowa. He was in Iowa legislatures. And he was slated to become the first governor of Iowa. And would have probably been the first governor of Iowa. But he had one little flaw. We all have a flaw. He had one little flaw. He drank a little bit too much. And that caused him a lot of problems. And he actually died just before we became a state. And as we know, Ansel Briggs ended up being the governor of Iowa, which was probably a good thing. Other people, of course, that were really prominent, Captain Warren that we talked about, the two of them were really close friends, and maybe this is important to the story. They served together in the Black Hawk War. They had done all sorts of things together, and now they found themselves busy working together, trying to shape what the state of Iowa would become. They were putting together the makings for the state of Iowa. Other people more over in our neck of the woods, right? Not in the Bellevue area, but over here, that were important were Anson Wilson and Shad Burleson. And important, of course, were William Brown and his charming wife, Edith. Now, other places you'll see that his charming wife was Betsy Brown. So I'm not sure how that all happened. But everybody said that she was beautiful, and she just was hospitable, and she made everybody welcome to the hotel. She was the greatest cook, and all of the roundabouts that came around were, loved her cooking. And so between she and her husband, they did a great job of establishing themselves in this new community. So Reverend Pastor Jar says that his book is a historical novel based on all the truths that he could dig up after so many years had passed away. But it was very engaging and believable, and anybody who reads it, and I hope you will come away with a good understanding of what went on. But he pointed the finger of blame where he saw it, right? So you have to read between the lines if you're looking for the right answer. The next person is Farmer Buckhorn, or John Seeley. And we talked about him not very long ago when we talked about the community of Buckhorn, right? He lived in this end of the county, one of the most prolific writers and historians in early Jackson County, and his pen name was Farmer Buckhorn. He lived in the Buckhorn settlement. He knew Shad Burleson well, and in 1806, he was writing about those things in the Annals of Jackson County for the Jackson County Historical Society. And he began by saying, 40 years ago, no man in Jackson County was better or more widely known than Shad Burleson. He said he was a remarkable man in many respects, of more than ordinary intelligence, shrewd, logical, forceful, resourceful, with a strong will and a clearly marked personality. So you see the county kind of being divided up. Our end of the county taking one side of things, and the Bellevue people were actually experiencing it, looking at the other side of the things. Well, Farmer Buckhorn wrote this book, and it's called Faults of History and Idols of Clay, the unpopular story of the Bellevue War. So he took the other side, and he was unpopular because of that. So I probably shouldn't call it a book, because what Farmer John Seeley, I should call him, what he did, he wrote in chapters published in the newspaper. So people were very entranced by all this, and they would cut out the newspaper articles, and they would make their own books from the newspaper articles. So his book wasn't published and out there where you could buy it. It was pieced together. But it has remarkable, remarkable history in it. And anybody who's talking about the Bellevue War should read his side of the story, because it was it was very, very different. His account of the Bellevue War, again, not published as a book, but only in chapters in the newspaper, but it made a great, great impression on the people living around here. And as they read and they saved his writings. And they would wait for the next edition of the newspaper to come out so that they could read the next chapter of the story. So, again, it's just important to know that the Bellevue War was understood very differently in Bellevue and that surrounding area than it was understood in Maquoketa, in Buckhorn, and the places over here, where it was thought of as the unpopular war. The Bellevue area people tended to side with the sheriff and Colonel Cox. They felt sure that Brown was the leader of the unruly gang of horse thieves, and they just wanted him gone. And I'm sure if we were living under conditions like that, we'd want him gone too. Anson Wilson was another big player in the Bellevue War. He was one of the more prominent men of the county, and we've talked about him many times. He was known as a very logical man that always looked at the truth of the matter and never took a side. He believed everybody should have their own opinion, but he felt that Brown was innocent. So historians like Farmer Buckhorn and J.W. Ellis and early settlers like J. Goodnow and Anson Wilson, they saw the Bellevue War under a completely different light. And though they were begged to participate in this vigilante order by Colonel Cox and by the sheriff, they refused to participate. So people from over our direction that they tried to draw in refused to take sides or refused to oppose Brown. They felt that Brown's big problem was that he was too successful. He was too charming and he was too wonderful, and because of that, that worked against him. People were jealous of him. And we know that he tried to run against William Warren, and he tried to get the congressional seat and all that sort of thing. He even ran at one point against the sheriff. So the powers to be in the Bellevue area felt kind of threatened by him because he was such a popular man. So there was jealousy was another excuse to maybe get rid of Brown. And so maybe that kind of played into the story as well. But to repeat Farmer Buckhorn's words, 40 years ago, no man in Jackson County was better or more widely known than Chad Burleson out here at the Buckhorn Inn, right? He was a remarkable man, and he was strongly on the side of the Browns. So when Chad Burleson over here heard about the war, I mean, he refused to go over, but when he heard about what had happened, he immediately went to Bellevue and he went to the rescue of Mrs. Brown. He became the executor of Brown's estate, didn't care what anybody thought over there, did what he thought was right, and he saw her through the tragic loss of her husband, helped them get all their affairs in order. I think that she perhaps stayed, I think they had one daughter, and perhaps she stayed in Bellevue for a year or so before she finally left. But you see how divided the county was becoming. And then we have the book that we've all heard about, Susan Lukey's book up there. Actually, the name of the book is important. It's not just the Bellevue War. It's the Bellevue War, Mandate of Justice or Murder by Mob. Susan Lukey researched for 15 years. She researched this book. It is so well researched that it's hard for me to read because it's so technical and so detailed and so whatever. But for somebody really studying the Bellevue War, she has got it all. But her purpose was to tell all sides of the story strictly according to the facts as she found them, and then to leave it to the reader to draw their own conclusions. So Susan, as you know, is a good friend of the Historical Society. Susan is a scholar. She writes, she researches, she edits, professionally edits books. She does a lot of things, and she leaves no stone unturned. she's a Bellevue native, and she said that she first became knowledgeable, heard of the Bellevue War when she was about 10 years old. And she heard about it from her dad, and she just became obsessed with it, like Pastor Jar did. And so she too started her research, and researched for a long time. I will tell you just from talking to her that Sheriff William Warren is her hero. I mean, but he's a hero for a lot of things other than just the Bellevue War. So, you know, maybe that doesn't influence what she says. But to kind of sum things up, what she says in a nutshell is that 6 years before Iowa became a state, there was a Wild West-style gun battle on Main Street in what is now the early Iowa town of Bellevue along the Mississippi River. And the skirmish became known as the Bellevue War. So we're just kind of rehashing here. The gang of outlaws had holed up in the town's hotel. The residents banded together to try and run them out of town. They confronted them on April 1st of 1840, and the sheriff tried to get them to surrender. They took the sheriff hostage, and William Brown, that's who they were after, the alleged outlaw leader, actually let Brown go. And she says from her research that this was the third time in just a small period of time that William Brown had saved the sheriff's life. But as soon as he let him go, the vigilantes marched on the hotel and they shot it out. So as many as 100 people were involved in this gunfight. Several people were killed or wounded, and it seems like about 10 people died. There's just not about 10 people died, many were wounded. The vigilantes were able to round up most of the outlaws. They were wanted for murder, for counterfeiting, for rustling and robbery in cases all across the Midwest, not just in Bellevue, but they had been wreaking havoc everywhere. So some of the residents of the frontier town wanted to do what? They wanted to hang these guys, right? That was some of the people. But in Susan's words, they actually maintained a noble attitude, as she calls it. And though some people wanted vengeance, they really did try, and they took a vote. This is where you hear about the red beans and the white beans. The residents, they used beans to vote. And by 3 beans, they decided to go with a traditional method, which was to whip them, put them on a raft, and send them down the river. And if you'll remember, that's what they did. 3 beans made the difference. Otherwise, they'd have all hung. So that's pretty amazing. She says that most of the outlaws never returned, never came. They were told never to come back, and she said most of them never came back here. But a few of them were tied to the murder of Davenport's founder, Colonel George Davenport, in his home just down the river in 1845. So here, 5 years after they were whipped and put on this raft, they took the life of Colonel Davenport. I don't know how many of you have been to Colonel Davenport's home and taken the tour of his home. I hope you have. I'm trying to think of her name. Paget? Patridge. Connie Patridge. Is that right? Who collects all the tins and things. She is a docent there. She does a wonderful job of giving tours. That's supposedly the oldest home, I think, in Jackson, I don't know, in the area. Very, very old. And she gives wonderful tours of that. I have begged and tried and connived to try to get her to come and do a brown bag lunch. I mean, it's just in her head about what happened that day at Colonel Davenport's house and what happened. But so far, she always promises, but she doesn't get here. Okay, so anyway, as Susan points out, the Bellevue War drew national attention. It was in every paper from coast to coast, as many papers as there were back in 1840. And she said that it set precedences in frontier justice, and it ignited more than a century of controversy, because she says that this case is still a subject of study in many law schools. But as we look at all 3 of the books by Jackson County authors, when taken together, they cover a very interesting and telling chapter in our history. The incident caused a great rift in our county, as I said, some of which, and I don't know if I have any pictures of the picture, some of which can be still seen today. And there's so many questions that are unanswered. We don't really know. Are we ever going to really know? There's questions. Was the action legal just because the sheriff was there? Was there a hidden motive by Cox and the sheriff? All three of these books by Jackson County authors taken together tell a story, but it's up to each individual person to decide what that story was. And who knows? Who knows? In August of 2015, the city of Bellevue celebrated what they called Bellevue 175-180, and the Historical Society helped with that. The 180 represented at that time the founding of the city of Bellevue. It was 180 years old. The 175 was the anniversary of the Bellevue War. I went to that. Did any of you go to that? Did you? It was awesome. They did a great job. It was such fun. They had food and all kinds of things, but it was also very, very educational. And they had invited all of the descendants that they could find of people who actually fought in the Bellevue War or lived there at the time or were somehow involved. And they gleaned a lot of information from these people. Kara, my daughter-in-law who works at the other museum, and her mother, Bonnie Thede, are among the relatives or the descendants that attended. And Bonnie Thede, Kara's mother, my grandchildren have 3 grandmas named Bonnie, a great-grandma and but Bonnie Thede actually spells her name B-O-N-N-E-Y because she was named after Edward Bonney that was part of the Civil War thing. So that's just kind of interesting. But I stole, without asking, pictures from the Bellevue War, of the Bellevue War reenactment that the Bellevue Herald Leader published. And I just thought it was fun to look at some of them. They just did a wonderful job for anybody who was there. I don't know the names of these people. The paper did not publish the names under the photos, but they just did a great job, and it was fun. So I just wanted to show you a couple of these pictures before we close. Do you know who that is, Karen? Who is it?
Kurt Zimet.
Kurt Zimet? Okay. Just everybody took part in this. There were dozens of people, and it was wonderfully done.
We took a chair over, that was Jerry Lucas.
Oh, did you?
And I had the tag on from the Historical Society here.
Oh, I remember that now.
And worked in,
yeah, we set up a little exhibit, and Karen and Kevin and everybody. Helen helped, I think.
I went to it.
You went to it, though? It was awesome. But they just did a great
job.
job.
Descendants went on a ride, a tractor ride with an open wagon, and it was very hot that day.
It was. It was very hot that day. Thank you. I had forgotten that part of it. Yeah. Do you know who this is?
Yeah, that's the fellow that owns
Rob Robin.
Who?
I think it's Rob Robin.
Rob Roman? Robin. Okay.
He's in the Legion in Bellevue.
Don't you think it looks like him?
It looks like him, yeah.
Well, he just did a wonderful job. I mean, they just made this thing come to life. It was really fun. And in history books, they show this building as being the remnants of the original Brown Hotel. I think we've decided that it was not.
No,
it's just wrong.
No.
But, yeah, it does, doesn't it? But anyway, you'll see that out there, but I think that's been changed. And this was kind of the only old map that I could come across, just to show you that you can see the Mississippi River here, and just how few buildings there were. Now we know that this map had to be after 1879, because this is the Bellevue Cascade Railroad. So this is a little later map, but even then, the town was really, really sparse. There just weren't that many people. So, and then I thought there was one more picture, maybe I didn't put it in. Anyway, it was just fun. And so I just want to say, as I was going through the files, the many files that we have about the Bellevue War, very, very well curated lately by our librarians, there was she's sitting over there pretending not to pay attention. Anyway, it's a pleasure to research in these files now because they're really getting very well organized. But going through those files, we found a copy of a play that was written by whom? Do you remember who wrote the play? Oh, and I didn't bring it down, I don't think. Anyway, it's a 3-act play about the Bellevue War that just looks incredible, and it was, if I could say her name, you'd know. Karen Tilton, maybe? Is that her name?
Yeah.
Okay, I think she probably is the one that wrote it, but it looks amazing. And I think that sometime we need to put on that play. So anybody who wants to audition for a certain part, just step up. But that would be just a fun thing to do. Roger?
Do you have anything definitive on how many people were killed or were not killed or anything along those lines? I was always uncertain about it.
They think that there was 10. And again, it's conflicting information. They think there were 10 killed, many, many wounded. And that's more people that were killed at the very infamous Battle of the OK Corral. Not even that many people were killed at that battle.
Wow.
So, you know, it was quite a thing. It was a tragedy. We don't really know. I mean, who really knows what happened? But, you know, it's fun to read this history and look at all the different things and maybe come up with our own conclusions once in a while instead of absolutely being told what happened. Joy?
When after they did the shooting, did they go in the hotel to find counterfeit money or any proof?
From what I've read, they set the hotel on fire in order to flush out the rest of the gang that was inside. So I don't know what they found. But people's horses beautiful. They always took the good stuff, right? Beautiful teams of horses, would be stolen just from people around there, and they would, try to trace them down. And there was always an excuse. But they said, in defense of William Brown, anytime something like that happened, he would just say, "Sorry, I don't know what happened," but he would reimburse the people for what they lost, and that's how he had goodwill with all the people, and he just, he just tried. Any questions or thoughts? Okay, that's kind of it. Thank you.